The voyage of the Dawn Treader begins with one of C.S. Lewis's most famous lines. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. Eustace Clarence Scrubb, the boy we get to know over the course of the book, is extremely pompous and annoying. The resemblance in the initials and even the tone between the two names, Eustace Clarence Scrubb and Clive Staples Lewis, gives us a hint that there may be further similarities between the character and his creator. Lewis, who disliked his own given name so much that he went by Jack all of his life, shared Eustace's sharp intellect as well as his lack of physical prowess. More importantly, as Lewis confesses, he also shared Eustace's besetting sin of pride. Lewis documents his struggles with this vice in his personal letters and in his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, acknowledging that at one point his prime motivation in life was a craving for glitter, swagger, and distinction, a burning desire to be viewed by others as someone in the know. In The Silver Chair, the next book in the series, Eustace will look back at his former self and exclaim, "Gosh, what a little tick I was." And this was a statement Lewis could very well have made about himself before his conversion. In January 1930, Lewis wrote a letter to his friend Arthur Greeves, presenting a frank portrait of his spiritual condition at the time.
During my afternoon meditations, which I attempt regularly now, I have found out ludicrous and terrible things about my own character. Sitting by, watching the rising thoughts, 1 out of every 3 is a thought of self-admiration. I catch myself posturing before the mirror, so to speak. I pretend I'm carefully thinking out what to say to the next pupil, for his good, of course, and then suddenly I realise I'm really thinking how frightfully clever I'm going to be and how he will admire me. I pretend I'm remembering an evening of good fellowship in a really friendly and charitable spirit. And all the time I'm really remembering how good a fellow I am and how well I talked. And then, when you force yourself to stop it, you admire yourself for doing that. There seems to be no end to it. Depth under depth of self-love and self-admiration.
Eustace, you may remember, became a literal dragon, and when he tried to get rid of the dragon skin, he could only remove a few of the surface layers. Ultimately, it would take the great lion Aslan to tear away all of the dragon skin to make Eustace a boy again. And not the boy he was, but the boy he was meant to be. Lewis found the same to be true in his own life. At best, he could make only superficial changes to his life. Only through God's and work toward becoming a new creature. In this session, we turn to Book 3 of Mere Christianity, Christian Behavior, and we look at what Lewis says about pride, or as he calls it, the great sin.
Mere Christianity is a remarkable book, and part of what gives it its power is the big ideas that Lewis covers in each of the different sections of it. He starts in Book 1, trying to answer the question, does God exist? What is the evidence for the existence of God? And he draws our attention to moral law, or our inborn sense of right and wrong, as a way of showing that there's probably something bigger than ourselves. In Book 2, he's trying to give us a kind of summary of what is it that's at the core of the Christian faith. What is it that all Christians in all times and all places have all agreed is the essential message of the gospel? In one beautiful and elegant sentence, Lewis says that the core of the Christian faith is simply this, that the death of Jesus has somehow made us right with God. In Book 3, Lewis is changing his focus away from these large and rather abstract issues to something very, very practical. If God exists, and if this is what Christians understand to be true, then how should we live? What ought to be the guidelines for our daily behavior? How should we make choices that guide our daily life? Lewis is brilliant in coming across this, and he does what Lewis does best. He gives us a word picture to help us really get a handle on this. He says, in trying to understand Christian behavior or virtue ethics, the image that helps us is the image of a group of boats. Think about a group of boats moving together across a large sea. He says that the rules for behavior for these boats as they move together in formation are rules that allow them to keep from colliding into one another, doing all kinds of damage to one another, or, on the other hand, sort of drifting apart and losing formation altogether. Rules for moral conduct are rules that allow the fleet to move together toward its destination. Now, we understand moral behavior in this way. It makes a lot of sense to us that to be honest and to be kind and to be generous helps us in our collective life. But Lewis says that's not quite enough. That's not enough to really take this fleet where it needs to go. There's something else that's necessary in order for these boats to be successful. And that's the individual boat within itself. Is the boat seaworthy? Is the boat in excellent condition? Is everything within the boat the best that it can be? And so these moral rules or moral guidelines, they're lots more than just guidelines for how we get along as neighbors, as families, as churches, or as nations. It's not just the guidelines for how we get along among ourselves, but what's happening within ourselves. In all of Lewis's writing, Lewis makes a real emphasis on the idea that people live forever. And so these concerns, what is the shape of my soul? What is the nature of my eternal being? These things are really important, and they deserve our best attention. So this image of the boats points to three different aspects of moral choice or Christian behavior. What are the guidelines that help us as we try to live together? Second, what are the things that help me to be the best that I can be? And that being the best part, that thinking about my nature or myself, it's a lot more than simply avoiding missteps or correcting my behavior. Lewis thinks the key really is, how am I cultivating moral habits so that making right choices becomes more natural to me, more inevitable? So no matter what situation I'm in, I tend to be kind, or I tend to be thoughtful or generous. Lewis is tying us into a very large sense of goodness, and that goodness has its root ultimately in that third thing, that big picture, that overarching purpose. In terms of that group of boats, Lewis says it's the idea of all of those boats heading in the same direction together in the right destination for some overall purpose. So moral choices have to do not just with getting along with others or how I tidy up my own life, but how my life and my life in relationship relates to these larger purposes, the ultimate purpose of life. So Lewis takes our attention far away from the idea of there simply being a list of do's and don'ts, yes and no, to try to get below that. You might think of it as digging down into motives what are the reasons for my behavior? And how can I address those reasons in such a way that I become not just a person who does kind acts, but a kinder person, so that some kind of change actually starts to take place in my nature. Lewis says the Christian guidelines for morality aren't just that it tidies up the way I behave, but it actually changes who I am. So by exercising that soul, by more and more actions of kindness, of thoughtfulness, of generosity, of goodness, I begin to become naturally the kind of person who engages in these, who radiates that kind of goodness, just as kind of the default setting. And that has eternal consequences because people live forever. And so that inner light, that inner goodness, that inner nature as it radiates out, helps us understand then what Lewis is talking about when he talks about ways that human beings go wrong. It gives us a different perspective of sin than simply a checklist of some kind for negative behaviors. If moral behavior is that which promotes goodness in our soul, then immoral behavior or sinful behavior is problematic not because of the way that God keeps score or this sin nature is part of displeasing God, although that may be the part of the case. But what Lewis continually draws our attention to is this. As eternal beings, those choices that we're making, good choices or bad choices, are changing the kind of person that we're becoming. So acts of kindness or generosity or thoughtfulness are changing us to become more thoughtful, more generous, more kind people. And in the same way, letting loose our anger, our frustration, our irritation, indulging in our envy of one another. These kinds of things become problematic not because of the behavior as much as that underlying motive and the way that it shapes our soul ultimately in terms of the kind of person that we're becoming. So when we're dealing with sin, Lewis gives us two particular helps that I think are really rather remarkable. Here's the first, that if we want to overcome an area of sin in our life, an area where we struggle, Lewis says, rather than engaging in that struggle, think of the opposite virtue and pursue the virtue. If we find that we have a tendency toward pride, then we think about humility as the opposite virtue, and we cultivate that. That crowds out the tendency to be proud. If we tend to be envious, we think about opportunities to promote and bless and support one another. That crowds out that impulse to envy and replaces it with a generous spirit. Lewis is following Dante's example here. Lewis thinks of himself largely in medieval terms, and he invokes the teaching of a medieval fellow in order to help to promote this idea. Dante says that if you want to overcome sin, the way to do that is to think about virtue, pursue that, and in doing so, you'll be turning your back on sin. When we understand the motive of goodness and the way that these things shape our souls, it becomes easier to understand why Lewis puts such a great emphasis on one particular sin, and that's the sin of pride. Pride, he says, is the base or the foundation, like the foundation of a building. It's the foundation of all other sin, because sin in its nature has to do with being self-absorbed. When we talk about pride, we need to counteract some of the misunderstandings that people have about the nature of pride. To feel good about oneself or to have self-esteem isn't the same as pride. That's not what Lewis is talking about at all. In fact, he suggests that the less self-esteem you have, the less good you feel about yourself, the more likely you are to want to puff yourself up, put emphasis on yourself, and put yourself out there in order to get attention and affirmation from others. But that's not pride, that's vanity. Pride is that tendency to be self-absorbed, to think about myself, to think about myself to the exclusion of others that I'm in relationship, or ultimate concerns like God and God's priorities. A person who's proud doesn't have the leisure to think about how to serve, how to be kind, how to reach out to others, because their focus is entirely on themselves. That self-centered state of mind is what's at the base of so much of the other things, the other sins, the other attitudes that are problematic in our lives. And what Lewis is inviting us to is to think not so much just about behavior, but to think about the shape of our souls, the character and nature of the lives that we live, and to connect our concerns with the larger concerns of life. So from Lewis's point of view, pride is the great sin. But it's important that we understand what he means by pride. Feeling good about our accomplishments, feeling good about ourselves, even enjoying the praise and positive encouragement of other people. That's not pride. Pride is a self-centered state of mind. It's self-absorption. It's thinking about every situation and every aspect of my life in terms of me. What do I think? What do I want? What do I need? It's ultimately setting a course for our life that's based on self-indulgence. So what is Lewis's advice for us if we want that to not be the guiding principle of our life? Lewis says that we can get out of that state of mind by focusing on the opposite virtue, the goodness that counterbalances that tendency that all of us have every day, all the time, to think only in terms of our own interests. That opposite virtue is humility. But humility is not thinking less of myself, putting myself down, apologizing for myself. Humility is focusing on the needs of others, is turning my attention away from my own concerns, my own self, how I'm being perceived, what people are thinking, and thinking more increasingly every day about how I might serve, how I might encourage, how I might help the people that I encounter. That's how I get to a place where increasingly my habits are to care for others and to reflect the genuine love of God in the various situations that I find myself in.
In the Screwtape letters, the senior devil, Screwtape, is concerned when his nephew's patient begins to associate with a circle of very committed and intelligent Christians. Screwtape warns his nephew about the powerful influence that friends can have on this new believer. He warns that the influence of this group of more mature believers could completely undermine their diabolical strategy to get him to fall back into his old ways. Lewis, of course, had his own very special circle of Christian friends who provided both encouragement and correction. They often met right here, in fact, just here behind me, at the Eagle and Child, or the Bird and Baby, as they call it. Beginning as a discussion group of writers who reviewed each other's works in progress, they also gave help and advice with personal matters. They call themselves the Inklings. Lewis's brother, Warnie, provides what may be the best surviving description of a typical meeting.
The ritual of an Inklings was unvarying. When half a dozen or so had arrived, tea would be produced, and then, when pipes were well alight, Jack would say, "Well, has nobody got anything to read us?" Out would come a manuscript, and we would settle down to sit in judgment upon it. Real unbiased judgment, too, since we were no mutual admiration society. Praise for good work was unstinted, but censure for bad work, or even not so good work, was often brutally frank. To read to the Inklings was a formidable ordeal.
J.R.R. Tolkien was a member of the Inklings and often read his ongoing saga called The Lord of the Rings to the group, right where we are. Lewis knew well the importance of surrounding himself with solid Christian friends in whom he could confide. His many letters suggest that their prayers and advice made all the difference in his spiritual journey. In this session, we looked at pride, the great sin. One check for this great sin, as Lewis knew, is to have friends who will remind you who you are and whom you have been called to serve. In our next session on Christian behavior, we turn from a great vice to a great virtue as we look at Christian hope.